Council. I hope that many of you on this session today were able to watch the China Town Hall with Fareed Zakaria, which just wrapped up a few moments ago. That was an interview with Fareed with Steve Orleans, the head of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. Following Fareed's remarks, we're really pleased today to bring you a number of China experts who are based here in Seattle. They're going to help us kind of sort through some of the key points of conflict and hopefully cooperation in the U.S.-China relationship. In the next hour, our panelists are going to address some of those thorny issues that Fareed Zakaria tried to address in the conversation just a moment ago. Today's event is brought to you by the Washington State China Relations Council and the China Studies Program, the Center for Global Studies, and the East Asia Center at the University of Washington. Before we get started, I want to make a few brief comments about the organization that I run, the Washington State China Relations Council. This was founded in 1979, and it's the oldest organization of its kind, which is promoting bilateral relationships between, in this case, Washington State and China. Our mission is to improve that relationship between the state and China, specifically in the areas of business, government, culture, and education. Since the onset of the pandemic, we've produced quite a few webinars on China-related topics, and we'd encourage all of you on today's call or today's event to look at our webinar to see what's our upcoming events, and also you can review many of our past programs and watch our YouTube channel. And now I'd like to introduce today's moderator and panelists so we can get started. Our moderator today is Nelson Dong, who's a partner at the Dorsey and Whitney law firm and the head of its national security group and co-head of its Asia group. Nelson has substantial experience in counseling clients on issues related to doing business in China, and particularly in China and Asia. He's a frequent panelist and a moderator for our events. I'm very pleased to note that he was recently named as one of 9 persons selected as board member of the year by the Puget Sound Business Journal for the substantial time and energy that he devotes to entities like ours. Now, I'm not going to go through everyone's bio in great detail. Please refer to our promotional materials or go to our website if you want to know what school they went to and some of their other accomplishments in the past. And now for our panelists. Our first panelist is Dr. Spencer Cohen, who's the principal and founder of High Peak Strategy, which is an international trade and economics research consulting firm based here in Seattle. He consults and writes extensively on international trade, China's economy, industry cultures, and regional economic analysis. We're pleased to announce that Spencer is a new Public Intellectual Program Fellow, which is a program with the National Committee on U.S. China Relations, and he was also a 2021 Seattle World Affairs Council Fellow. And he's an affiliate professor in the Department of Geography at UW. Our next panelist is Dr. Tabitha Grace Mallory, who's the founder and CEO of the consulting firm China Ocean Institute and an affiliate professor at the University of Washington Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies. Dr. Mallory specializes in Chinese foreign and environmental policy. She conducts research on China and global ocean governance and has published works on China's fisheries and ocean policies. And a recurring theme that you'll hear here, that she was a 2019 and 20 Public Intellectual Program Fellow with the National Committee. And our third panelist is Dr. Susan Whiting, a professor of political science at the University of Washington here in Seattle. She holds an adjunct appointments in both the Jackson School of International Studies and the School of Law. She specializes in Chinese and comparative politics with an emphasis on the political economy of development. And she too was a public intellectual programs graduate in the first cohort back around 2005 with the National Committee. So we welcome all our panelists and our moderator, and we look forward to an excellent program. As far as housekeeping notes, again, we ask all of you to remain on mute throughout the sessions. If you have questions, please submit them in the chat box. Nelson will do his best to get to them. We apologize, we probably won't get to all your questions, but we'll do our best. And with that, Nelson, let me turn the session over to you.
Thank you very much, Norrin. It's a pleasure for me to be moderating such a fine group of panelists, particularly those who are all PIP alumni. One of the other attributes that I bring to this is that I'm a board member of the National Committee as well, and have voted out all of these PIP fellows in past sessions as a director. So it's really a great honor and privilege for me to be moderating a group of 3 alumni of the program. I'm going to begin by asking each of our panelists to remark from their own perspective and experience what their takeaway messages were from Fareed Zakaria's observations with Steve Orland's. And then we'll come back and do some global questions, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. So if Spencer, you wouldn't mind kicking us off?
Cool. Thank you, Nelson. And thank you, Noor and the China Relations Council for the opportunity to share my thoughts on today's discussion. So one of the main takeaways that I took was that based on Mr. Zakaria's comments, is that we're an important inflection point in U.S.-China relations. And there's a lot of angst on both the U.S. side and the China side. And that angst can materialize in positive and negative ways. Certainly, on the U.S. side, we've seen opportunists, I would describe people like Josh Hawley, who have come out in more of a vitriolic rhetoric around the U.S.-China relationship. But there's also a way to approach this relationship in a positive way. For instance, investing in U.S. competitiveness, U.S. innovation, investing in U.S. manufacturing. The U.S. has over the years, just to sort of provide a framework, the U.S. over the years has experienced significant decline in manufacturing employment. How much of that is actually attributable to China is questionable. Mr. Zakaria called out, for instance, that the more recent estimates that have shown that it's been quite minimal. But nonetheless, there's been a lot of angst in the U.S. about our competitiveness and a lot of domestic issues that are China's being cast as sort of the foil in source. On the Chinese side, China has also facing a lot of headwinds that could be animating a lot of its policy and again, complicating our relationship with China as well. We've seen that especially with China's growth model that's beginning to yield fewer dividends to the Chinese economy over time. We've seen, for instance, that there's a much less cooperative environment for globally to absorb a lot of China's significant current account surpluses as we have in the past. And we saw that real pushback with the Trump administration, even though the way the Trump administration handled its response to that issue was very clumsy. There was a lot of built up, sort of pent up energy to address a lot of what we're seeing as unfair trade practices with China. China is also facing issues around demographics. We've seen with the one-child policy that there's been, even with there's been a reduction in the working age population now that's now coming to bear because of the one-child policy. And despite all the efforts to open up and to do away with the one-child policy and the two-child policy, it's been really hard to stimulate more population growth, which is a real challenge because two of the ways an economy grows typically are through population growth and through productivity growth. And productivity growth has also been in decline over the last 10 years, which is another big issue that China's been facing. And that, again, it can be attributed to a lot of factors having to do with, again, exhausting the initial sort of drivers of China's growth model and expansive amount of debt that's yielding less and less output per worker, for instance. In addition to growing costs, there's also, for raising a child, there's also perceived in the trade war to be a lot of vulnerabilities in China's supply chains. And we've seen how China's responded to that with the dual circulation model or dual circulation approach as one way to try to address that. But that is seen as a major vulnerability in China's growth model as well. So I would just leave it probably at that for now before we get into more detailed discussion, but simply to say that on both sides, there's a lot of angst. Again, we're seeing, again, a lot of angst in the US about a period where a lot of disillusionment with the way the US has approached China and approached how to work with China. And on the Chinese side, a lot of angst about the declining returns on the existing model and a need for structural reform that's not happened. And it's been really difficult, even though the government identifies the need for structural reform and to boost consumption, it's been really difficult to actually implement structural reforms. So as back to Mr. Zakaria's points about having a strategic framework is really important to try to manage this and lower the temperature on both sides for this kind of angst.
Spencer, could I ask you to go back and re-explain the dual circulation concept again? This is a vocabulary term for sort of insiders in U.S. China relations, but not everybody in our audience may understand that terminology.
Sure. So the dual circulation framework has been integrated. It's a concept that was introduced in 2020. And what it essentially means in a nutshell is that the two circulations are the domestic circulation and the external circulation. So essentially, the government wants to find ways to both boost exports and to improve the competitiveness of its companies globally. But it also wants to help to make the Chinese economy more resilient. And this is largely in reaction to the trade war and to the Trump administration putting many Chinese tech companies or manufacturing tech companies onto its U.S. Commerce Entity List and subject to export controls and prohibitions on U.S. companies doing business with them. So the dual circulation idea is both to boost both the external competitiveness of Chinese companies, but also to find ways to make the domestic economy more resilient, which in practical terms would mean investing in addressing the supply chain vulnerabilities, such as, for instance, investing in microchips, which the government has spent a lot of money on over the years, billions, but has not been very successful. But that's the general idea.
Thank you very much, Spencer, for that. Tabitha, can I ask you to go next and share your observations and extracted takeaway messages from our program with the National Committee today?
Yes, thank you, Nelson. And I want to thank the National Committee on U.S. China Relations for holding this event, which I think is just a great format. Also, thanks to the Washington State China Relations Council, to Noor, to Man for helping organize, the University of Washington for also co-hosting, and to Nelson for moderating. So I thought, I would just kind of comment on a few points that Fareed Zakaria made that I thought were just, really important takeaways. And like Steve Orland said too, I am also pretty worried about the U.S.-China relationship right now. And in addition to a lot of the kind of higher level issues like, the defense and military relationship with China, a lot of the economic issues that Spencer just did a great job of kind of discussing and summarizing. One of the things that I really worry about, which I think didn't come out as much in what Fareed was saying, is that the people-to-people relationship is also really important. And I think the situation that we're currently in is really detracting from that interaction that would otherwise be, just creating a lot more trust in this relationship. And so, one of the things that Fareed Zakaria said was that, today we don't see the same kind of isolated, autarkic structure that we had in the Cold War. In terms of trade, we have so much more trade now than we did then. But we do, thanks to COVID, really do have a pretty isolated two different worlds right now, or many different worlds if you consider the whole world. But, it's really hard right now to go to China. I mean, I haven't gone to China in about 2 years. And it also means that, so it's not just COVID, but, a lot of people suspect that, China could be using this as an excuse to deny more visas. The increased tensions mean also that fewer people in the US are interested in going to China. I'm on the board of an organization that provides support for students going to study Chinese, and students want to not study in Beijing right now. They want to go to other places where they can study Chinese, and fewer people want to go work in China. And I think that really has some repercussions in terms of the types of cooperation that we can have moving forward. Like in my personal case, I haven't been to China in 2 years. I was supposed to go last year to teach a short course at a university, which would have been, the foundation for, future types of cooperation. And so, so I think that's a loss. And certainly we've had a bunch of virtual events, but even that now is becoming a problem because, Chinese counterparts, given the domestic environment over there, the strict political control, feel nervous about speaking on these, in these events. And also increasingly, they have to get permission to even participate in these events. So that's something that I find concerning. In terms of, trying to think of positives, which I do try to do, when it comes to environmental issues, I do think there are some positive developments there. And Fareed Zakaria spoke a little bit about climate change. He was a little bit less sanguine about cooperation. He was kind of saying that the US and China are pursuing developments to address climate change more in parallel. But if you take the long-term view, there really has been a lot of progress on climate change. And then in terms of the issue that I really do a lot of research on, ocean and fisheries policy, there has been a lot of improvements there. China taking steps to address illegal fishing around the world, for example. And a lot of that has been in response to the international pressure on China to be a better actor in this space, which brings me to another point that I wanted to make that I thought was really important, just to underscore what Fareed Zakaria said, and that is the need for the US to work with other countries around the world, kind of in an international community with China, with our allies and partners. And I think as we get into the discussion and talk about more of the, the particular issues that will come out, as examples as to how we can do that. And then also I think, it's important to remember, I think he said, his words about this were really great. He said that, we both need to be going to each other's countries and everything. And, I think it's important to also ask, what can we learn from each other to improve our shared human experience? Spencer also mentioned, the strategic and economic dialogue. Fareed Zakaria mentioned that too. That framework was criticized for, just a lot of air and not a lot of, work behind it. But, having frameworks like that, having ways, forums that we can cooperate through it, I think is really good. Because in the end, they're both really big, fascinating countries. What originally drew me to China was not so much thinking about strategic, geopolitical issues, but really just a fascination with the culture and the language. And I just, hope through all of this that we can remember that as well as a component of the relationship. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tabitha. Susan, your turn to take a swing at this as well.
Yes. Thank you, Nelson, for all your work in the U.S. China policy community. Thanks to the National Committee and the Washington State China Relations Council for hosting. My own work focuses on the role of the state in China's economic development. And so I want to focus my comments there, and to the extent they affect the U.S.-China relationship. One challenge that's widely perceived is the statist turn in China's contemporary economic policy. We're really used to thinking about industrial policy in the post-World War II era as a tool, a means for poor countries to catch up with more developed countries. And no better examples of that than the East Asian NICs, the newly industrialized countries. China differs from the NICs in some ways and not in others. An early historical difference is just the legacy of the planned economy that China started integrating into the global economy from a period of state domination. In the era of the first 4 decades of reform and opening, it began to look more familiar. It introduced markets, right? And this revealed China's comparative advantage in cheap labor that is now eroding, and as we can discuss later. It also opened up not only to domestic private enterprises, but of course to foreign direct investment. And the Chinese state used what are familiar traditional tools of industrial policy to integrate into global supply chains. Tax breaks, low interest loans, tariffs, and especially after its accession to WTO, non-tariff barriers. This helped integrate China into global supply chains to help it catch up economically. So at that phase, that had significance for US firms in 2 ways that are still present today. Firms, whether it be like Apple or Nike, oversee supply chains centered in Asia. tech components come from Korea, Japan, as well as the US, and they oversee subcontracting for labor-intensive assembly, notably through many Taiwanese-owned firms invested in China. Some of this will move out of China as its labor cost advantage erodes, but it has also agglomeration advantages where it brings all of these things together in a very effective way. That's benefited firms, it's benefited US consumers with cheaper products. US firms also played in the China market as investors. If you think about brands like General Motors, they invested and transferred technology to factories in China. Not only China, right? GM invests around the world, but its like newest facility was built in 2013, only a few years ago. And this has become a major market for US firms. Like part of their incentive to locate there is to access the Chinese market as it has come into its like kind of consumer middle class stage. And 40% of GM's global vehicle sales are in China. Only a very small part of their profits come from China. So this was the stage of what we think of as this kind of traditional industrial policy. But today, those dynamics exist. And at the same time, China has caught up. And so I think what's different is that today we see China using the tools of industrial policy no longer to catch up, but at the global technological frontier. Just for a few examples, we see that the state-run commercial banks are increasingly directing lending to state-owned enterprises away from private firms. Guidance funds on the order of trillions of US dollars are going to support priority sectors like artificial intelligence, semiconductors, robotics. This program is not guaranteed of success, but it poses challenges for other players in the global political economy. It's less integrated globally for a variety of reasons. One of those is national security. But there's also now competition at the global technological frontier. And it remains to be seen whether that's going to be kind of zero-sum competition or positive sum win-win competition. So I'll just pause on my comments there. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I'd like to come back to Tabitha for a moment. You know, you had in your comments earlier talked a bit about the need for more multilateral cooperation, particularly in regard to fisheries and maritime issues. But I think the Philippines appealed to the International Court and took China to arbitration. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what happened there?
Yes, great question. And actually, I should say too that even though there's been some progress with regard to fishing around the world on China's behavior, that's except for the South China Sea. The South China Sea is kind of its own issue. And so, you know, I think the South China Sea is also a great example of, you know, how it's really important to think multilaterally about, you know, responses to the actions there. And so, you know, the disputes have been going on for decades, really kind of started heating up, you know, in the 1960s and 70s, you know, once the oil reserves were discovered in the seabed. And then, you know, throughout the 1990s, especially, there were a lot of conflicts, which were somewhat paused in the first decade of the 2000s, the aughts, once you had a declaration of a code of conduct, but then kind of started to heat up again in 2009 when states started to submit applications to extend their continental shelves. Without going into too much technical detail here, you know, countries around the world get about 200 nautical miles of exclusive economic zone where they have jurisdiction over the economic resources there. And if your continental shelf naturally extends beyond that, they're supposed to roughly line up to the continental shelf, you can apply to extend it. So Malaysia and Vietnam did that. The Philippines also around that time they kind of redesigned their baselines to be more in accordance with international law. And all of these moves really started to heat up the issue again. Around this time, we also saw the U.S. policy of initially the pivot to China and then the rebalancing, or to Asia, which a lot of people saw as being China directed. So a lot. This was in the wake of the financial crisis and kind of China's newfound strength coming out of that crisis vis-a-vis some of the other developed countries. Then in 2013, the Philippines filed a case with the International Court of Arbitration, well, the UNCLOS, which was kicked down to the Court of Arbitration to protest China's claims in the South China Sea, arguing that they had destroyed some of the environmental resources that belonged to the Philippines. Eventually the case ruling was hundreds of pages long. And so the ruling came out in 2016, almost all in favor of the Philippines. And, over that time was when we saw the building out of the features in the Spratlys, which are the features in the south part of the South China Sea, and a lot of just the kind of escalation, the more what a lot of people refer to as the assertive behavior in the South China Sea. And, there's a saying that, there's a lot of debate between the international relations scholars who see the world largely in terms of power, and then, the kind of international law world, which, sees the world in terms of the institutions that we put in place. And they kind of, these groups of people will talk about what matters more, the power or the law. And, a lot of people would say that, if you've got the power, you will use that, which is what I think we've seen China do in the South China Sea, because they have more power, especially bilaterally vis-a-vis these other countries like the Philippines, which is a much smaller country. And so a country like the Philippines, a much smaller country, will usually resort to using the international institutions, legal conventions that can help support their claims. And there's some, skepticism as to, China has just, resoundingly, just denied that this case ruling holds any weight. They are refusing to abide by it. I think in subtle ways, China has actually changed its tone a little bit. So I think that says something about the power of international institutions. But yeah, that's a lot of the dynamic there. And just back to the kind of starting point I made is, because China has in some ways been, very surprisingly unilateral and just, assertive, aggressive, some people would even say, on this issue. It really has pushed a lot of U.S. allies and partners kind of into the, U.S., kind of embrace, support. And so, it just, there's a lot there in terms of, the U.S. working with our partners to kind of, as Fareed Zakaria was saying, balance China and kind of tamp down the power plays there with China. So hope that was a good description of what's going on.
It's a very complicated subject, as you clearly have outlined. Susan, if I could swing the conversation back to you, since you're the political scientist on this panel. Traditionally, Chinese culture has focused a lot on the concept of cycles. And we happen to have a domestic political cycle in the United States with midterms coming up next year. And every other person practically running for the Republican nomination now, including former President Trump. On the other hand, you have a much more predictable and organized political system domestically in China with the CCP. Could you talk a little bit about how those two sets of cycles are going to interact over the next couple of years and what that might mean for the bilateral relationship between the two countries?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And to some extent, our political cycle with congressional elections every 2 years and presidential elections every 4 years is very, very short. And to look at it from a different perspective, the cycles might be bigger than political terms. So one thing I would point to is, for example, the Pew Research Center has monitored attitudes towards China. And unfavorable attitudes among US respondents towards China have been increasing since 2012, roughly. They accelerated during the Trump administration, so that now instead of 40% of respondents have a negative view towards China, it's 66%. But that's a deeper trend. It predates the Trump administration and it continues past the Trump administration. As Fareed mentioned, the Biden administration has not reversed some of the Trump policies towards China, right? So I think maybe these trends are bigger. And on the side of China, state support for these key sectors in the new economy, the technology economy, really predate the Xi Jinping administration. They date back to 2006, 2007, the first decade of the 21st century, in reorienting China's industrial policy. If we think about other aspects of potential flashpoints in the U.S.-China relationship, popular attitudes towards reunification with Taiwan, right, are very long-standing, very strong among the Chinese public. So I think there may be trends in the 21st century that are bigger than even our electoral cycle or the administrations in China.
Since you also studied domestic Chinese politics, could you talk a little bit about the elongated tenure for President Xi and Secretary Xi at this point?
Yes, so there is no written rule that says a general secretary has to step down at any point in time, but there is an informal norm just in the past few administrations. Jiang Zemin ultimately did step down and turn things over to Hu Jintao as general secretary. Hu Jintao, after his second term, turned things over to Xi Jinping. That's a gross simplification, of course. And General Secretary Xi is coming up on the end of his second term. Symbolically, they have eliminated term limits on the office of president. That's separate from the party. But that's a signal that he may not respect this kind of unwritten rule in the post-Mao era of two-term leadership. And I think that introduces unprecedented risks into the political system. One of the greatest challenges for one-party political regimes is succession. And that befuddled and racked China in the Mao era. And I think the risk of turning to that again introduces risks in terms of how to address policy debates and those other aspirants for leadership. So I think it greatly increases the risk of instability.
So you wouldn't draw a parallel between the unwritten rule that FDR overrode when he ran for a third term and went beyond the customary two-term limit of U.S. presidents?
Yeah, that's an interesting comparison. But I think also the U.S. is much more, set of institutions that balance the presidency, and we don't see that kind of check and balance, institutional check and balance in China. So the power in the party is really important. That said, I don't think Xi Jinping is all powerful. In some ways, it's surprising that reforms that might address crisis in the property sector, for example, haven't been undertaken. For example, reforms in the land market that would allow farm households to sell their land directly to developers, reforms in the fiscal system that would institute a property tax to reduce speculation on property, to better fund local governments, to reduce their reliance on land sales, reforms in the banking system to slow down that flow of funds to land-backed kind of activity. It's surprising in some respects that those have been on the agenda for a decade, every single one of them, and they have not moved forward dramatically. I think the reason for that is that they would alienate the interests of local governments and alienate the interests of the urban middle class. So maybe there's some powerful players that Xi Jinping can't just override easily.
Thank you for that further comment. Spencer, let me come back to you. I'd like to focus a little bit on sort of the here and now with the buzzword of supply chain and all of the backed up shipments that are coming over, the shortage of containers, the backlog of ships being unloaded at ports like Long Beach and Los Angeles, and what we're looking to in terms of these expanded globalized supply chains that Fareed and Steve talked about earlier in their presentation. Can you give us a sense of what we can expect near term and long term?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Thanks for asking that. So first, just to address the issue of the port backups. So in the news, we've seen a lot of coverage of vessels, cargo vessels that, for instance, Port of Long Beach, LA Long Beach, that are offshore, oftentimes anchored or not even anchored, further offshore. And a lot of that is more a function in the near term of a sudden resurgence in retailer demand in the US after a relatively subdued, subdued purchasing and building of inventories during the pandemic. You've seen a big surge in the last few months of retailer demand. And you marry that with a lot of the shipping companies, which are already a very cutthroat industry and very, very thin margin industry globally. And that we've seen a lot of consolidation as well. That's for a lot of them to scale back capacity from moving cargo during the lull during the pandemic. So that's sort of like a perfect storm, so to speak, that's led to that. But more broadly on the subject of supply chains, one of the big concerns mentioned before was about, because of the trade war, both sides, it was sort of a revelatory moment for both sides. On the Chinese side, the trade war and the commerce entity list, for instance, and prohibitions on companies doing work with Chinese companies such as Huawei and ZTE and AVIC really helped to expose or lay bare the vulnerabilities in China's supply chains. So on the Chinese side, there's been a lot more focus on investing in those and shoring up those investments in that capacity. Whether or not they'll be successful is another story, but at least we've seen with, as mentioned before, dual circulation, and also more recently in 2021, Xi Jinping has come out with one of his speeches talked about new economic theory of economic growth, the new economic theory. And both of those really put a lot of focus on so-called high quality growth and not residual growth, such as real estate, such as companies like Evergrande, for instance, which I'm sure people have read in the news recently about, but putting much more emphasis. So that could be one source of decoupling potentially, is China really trying to find ways to shore up that vulnerability. The trade war also illustrated on the US side those same vulnerabilities for US companies and households. So, tariffs are a tax. That tax is paid by importers. In many cases, as we saw during the trade war, the cost of those tariffs was being borne by importing manufacturers that were relying upon Chinese goods, everything from advanced manufacturing to wineries that actually import glass bottles from China. And we also saw that households were also absorbing a lot of that cost, or bearing a lot of that cost as well, in the form of higher cost household goods. So I think looking forward, we have seen as well, in a couple weeks ago, USTR Tai gave a really important speech at the Center for Strategic International Studies, where she announced that the US is going to retain the Trump era tariffs. And there's really no political capital to be gained from the administration pulling those back and being perceived as being soft on China. And just like Fareed Zakaria mentioned, US voters don't vote on foreign policy. They vote on domestic policies and basically delegate that to Congress and to the executive branch. So there's not a lot of political capital for the US to rescind those tariffs, even though there has been talk of a so-called recoupling afterwards. So I think for a lot of companies, they've been very scarred and traumatized by the impact of the trade war, and they're going to be looking to diversify as much as they can into other markets to source goods. The question is, like, how much is that actually possible? For the reasons that China has already, as Professor Whiting mentioned about the agglomeration effects of having lots of manufacturers concentrated in one country, in one ecosystem, it's going to be hard to replicate that in the economies of scale that are achievable in places like Vietnam or Malaysia or even South America. So I think a lot of companies will look at opportunities to relocate their supply chains or part of it, but they're going to have to also consider the wherewithal and the ability to do that, the available labor force to do that, the intermodal capacity to do that. And also for those companies that are not just nowadays sourcing materials in China, but also selling into the Chinese market, that'll be another major consideration we'll have to think about. But for the time being, I don't see a lot of change with respect to trade policy, and that's going to affect a lot of that calculus that they'll be thinking about.
So Fareed apologized to our neighbors in Mexico and Canada, but would you care to tack on a footnote to your comment, Spencer, about whether sort of reshoring some of those supply chains nearer to the United States and having suppliers in Canada or Mexico might help meet some of those concerns about these vulnerable supply chains that American manufacturers have? Can Canada and Mexico together supply some of that need and lessen the U.S. dependence on Chinese suppliers?
I think for U.S. companies that are not as invested in growing their consumer base in China and are solely or primarily using China as a source for their inputs and raw materials, as well as like low-cost assemblage of final goods to be resold or exported back to the U.S. market, that could make a lot of sense. In Canada, the risk is cost. Because even though Chinese wages have been ascendant since 2010 because of the ultimately exhausting of that cheap rural labor force, it's still relatively cheap relative to China. Mexico and Canada, I haven't looked at really at the wage difference, but they're converging, Mexico and China. So that could be a location. The other benefit, as much as we talked about the TPP, the US Mexico-Canada agreement, so the USMCA, is effectively the TPP. So we would also gain a lot of the benefits of the TPP, or what is now the CPTPP, by investing or expanding, supply chain operation activities in those two countries. So, but the other element too is that automation is still, even when we've seen with reshoring of manufacturing from China and elsewhere, a lot of that, the employment footprint is a lot less. So companies have been able to figure out how to make it cost effective through automation processes. Sometimes it's also because they simply can't find the workers to begin with. So they're prompted, there's upward pressure for them to automate. But a lot of the reshoring has actually happened or been allowed or enabled to happen through automation.
Tabitha, let me swing the attention back to you for a moment and call upon your knowledge about the South China Seas, which we displayed a few minutes ago. Every so often we get this flash bulletin that the U.S. Navy and the PLA Navy have had another close encounter out there. Could you help our audience understand what freedom of navigation operations are about? Why does the United States send ships through that part of the world? And now we've apparently convinced the Royal Navy and the UK to do the same. And presumably we're talking to the Australians as well along those lines. Why are those things happening? And how does that feed into this tension between the United States and China?
Yes, great question. Really important part of that bilateral relationship. So freedom of navigation is something that comes out of the law of the sea framework, and it's the freedom, and most countries agree with this interpretation. The US and China have a disagreement about the interpretation, but most countries, and what the international law says is that states have the freedom to navigate essentially through all the waters around the world. There are some differences if it's within the territorial zone, which is 12 nautical miles from shore, versus the exclusive economic zone, which I mentioned earlier, which is 200 nautical miles from shore. And so trying to skip over some of the technical stuff here, but where the US and China differ is that the US sees freedom of navigation as including peacetime military operations in EEZs. So, and this is also the agreement of most countries around the world. And China's interpretation of that is that it does not include peacetime military operations in EEZs. So what the US does, and it's not just in the South China Sea, it's all over the world, they do routine exercises called freedom of navigation operations, or FONOPs, just to demonstrate that this right exists, to navigate around the world. And by peacetime military operations, it's things like, maybe some reconnaissance and surveillance activities, exercises like man overboard exercises, things like that, not testing weapons or anything like that, but it's kind of the exercises that a military vessel might do. And it also extends into the airspace as well. And so, China very vocally protests these FONOPs. The US does a number of them every year. And it's interesting because if we think about, the potential for flashpoints in East Asia, and, the South China Sea is kind of, we think a lot about the potential for flashpoints there. Also the cross-strait relationship with Taiwan. It's not really the FONOPs that are the danger. I mean, I think they get a lot of attention in the media, but they are routine, and the Chinese side expects them. They give a lot of media attention to them, but because it's just, so routine, there's not as much of a risk of escalation as there is with other activities. And so, the other types of activities I think are more dangerous is things like what a lot of people call the gray zone operations. And so that's activities that are by vessels that are not military or even paramilitary, like Coast Guards. You've got your Navy ships, your Coast Guards, which are kind of like, they're kind of like in between military and civilian. But what China, does is pays some of its fishing vessels to assert claims in the South China Sea, just by being there, being present there, and those fishing vessels often come into contact with other fishing vessels, Coast Guard vessels from other countries, and there is a lot of potential for escalation because these are not routine activities. There's a lot of uncertainty about what that kind of like chain of command is from the center. Who ultimately would, at least if it's with the Navy, what the chain of command is. Hopefully, I think military to military communication is really important. That's another issue, but in theory, the heads of these militaries could call each other and, like essentially call this off, but it's less clear. It's less expected and less routine with something like the maritime militia, these gray zone operations. And it makes it harder to challenge them because, the optics of like firing on what, is ostensibly a fishing vessel, that's not great. So, there's that. There's unexpected activities, or at least an escalation in activities, such as the flights that the PLA Air Force has been sending around Taiwan, which recently set a record. There was 56 flights in Taiwan's ADIZ, the Air Defense Identification Zone, in one day, and there was like 149 across 4 days. And so that kind of provocation, there's just, it's very unexpected. And so it makes it harder to kind of, de-escalate that in some cases, especially if, you're not sure who's directing this kind of activities. It's just someone who's on, the ship or, the plane, or is this kind of from the center level? And, it's worrisome because we're also talking about nuclear powers here. And, China has a no first use policy, but, they wouldn't survive probably a first strike. So, if you think just again, back in just like the power terms, it's a big question mark. Could this actually escalate to that point? And so I think, in dealing with these issues, I think, again, I mentioned the military to military communication. I think that's really important to keep those channels open, and oftentimes they disintegrate when tensions rise between the US and China. But also focusing on conflict management, and there are a number of fora for both countries to do that. But it's really important that both countries are committed to using those arrangements that are set up. Sometimes they're not, and and I think with regard to the U.S., I mean, it's really important for the U.S., I think, to take a stance on this, not back down, but set expectations. We don't want. I think ambiguity is risky. We don't want a repeat of the defense perimeter that the Dean Acheson speech that set off essentially led to the Korean War. So we need to be really careful about what we say. But if we don't do anything to respond to some of this activity, it is essentially an implicit go ahead for China to continue this kind of behavior. And so it's really, it's tough. I mean, it's a situation that it's not easy to deal with. And back to that point about multilateral cooperation, I think that really matters here. The AUKUS agreement that was just struck between the UK and Australia. There's a lot of Southeast Asian countries to work with. The Europeans are increasingly in the South China Sea, European naval forces from the UK, France, Netherlands, Germany, and of course, Japan, South Korea. And I think, the message being not that, we want to, we certainly do not, we want to make clear that we don't want a war with China. But I think the message that, we want to cooperate with China, and that there's so many different actors. It's not just the U.S. I mean, China often sees the U.S. as being kind of behind, like directing the activities of other countries. But I think it sends a really strong message when it's other countries independently pushing back against China's behavior. And China is more likely to consider that if it's not just coming from the U.S. or being seen as U.S. directed.
Thanks for that nuanced picture. I'm going to ask one last final question as the moderator, and then we'll turn it over to audience questions that Mon will read aloud. But I'd like to do a joint question to Spencer and Susan. And this really has to do with something that both of you have already adverted to, and it was also covered by Fareed. And that's this serious interest on the part of China in reducing its perceived vulnerability, particularly within their state-owned enterprises and their national champion companies, to the kind of pressure that an entity list designation for Huawei or a ZTE produces on their economy. And then the US wanting to deny access to more and more American technology. So that would seem to pose a very serious conundrum for a whole range of American industries, from GE jet engines to Microsoft software to Boeing aircraft, and the list could go on. How do you see this playing out as a matter both of economics and of sort of politics in the two countries? Are these two sets of trends in each country going to drive the decoupling that was only talked about a few years ago? Susan and Spencer, can you take a swing at that?
Do you want to go ahead, Spencer? Or shall I?
You can go first.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I think there. I'm not sure. The U.S. certainly has what it's defined as national security concerns around these technologies, and at the same time, I think the Chinese government has articulated, as I alluded to earlier, in its industrial policy of at the global technological frontier itself becoming an innovator and a leader. I think given its statist orientation, that may be difficult to achieve because it's not as open to competition, which really drives innovation. So that may be a goal that's very hard to achieve. But I'm not sure it's a reaction to the U.S. I think these are proceeding in parallel. And I think because competition drives innovation, I think it's important for the U.S. to focus on innovation and the conditions in which that can really thrive. Because we can't control what China is going to do, and we may not have the leverage or want to use that leverage. But I think China certainly aspires to innovation through a very different kind of mode of development. So I think the U.S. should focus on its own house in terms of developing advanced technologies, infrastructure, human capital. I think that's our best approach.
I wholeheartedly agree with Susan's diagnosis and prescription to focus on our own innovation capacity and competitiveness. I think that a lot of what China is trying to accomplish is actually quite rational. Any country wants to be a leader in technology. Any country wants to be a global leader in innovation. I think the challenges for China, China faces something that has a unique condition that we don't have, and it not only state capitalism, but China has this conundrum where they might become old before they become rich. And that's a huge concern. And I think the government is seeing that so much of the investments in the last 10 years, and especially this significant surge in debt up to about, at one point last year, 270% of GDP, much of that was going to those non-productive industries, real estate, but a lot of those also going to things that the government has deemed to be not in alignment with those long-term industrial goals to promote innovation and be competitive globally. And those are things such as, online gaming, other forms like rideshare services like Didi. So the government has sort of sent signals that its priorities are investing in those pillar industries in technologies such as AI, such as, aerospace. So I think, in the long run, certainly China wants to achieve what the US has accomplished in terms of technological leadership, especially in areas such as aerospace. They're a long ways away though, but they're certainly catching up. We see that with Boeing, and we see that with COMAC, for instance, where COMAC, the C919 is it's emerging as a competitor with the 737, but it's several generations behind still technologically. But in the long run, I think that the global competitive space is going to be US competing with Chinese companies in other parts of the world is going to be the biggest challenge for the US. So, but investing in our own innovation capacity is most important.
Thank you for those final comments. I'm going to turn the microphone over to Mon at this point, who will read several of the audience questions. And I just want to give a heads up to the audience that because we started a little late due to the lengthening of the program from New York, that we will also go over a few minutes, but probably we will wind up in the next 10 or 15. So if you have the time, please stay with us and listen to the answers that our panelists are going to give to these questions from the audience. Mon, over to you.
Nor, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Nora, are you going to read the
Nor,
question?
you're muted.
Sorry, Mon has asked me to step in and help out with this part.
Great.
So
If you would do us the honors, please.
Okay, there's a little conversation going in the chat box, which I think I'll just explain. And that's, people are asking about why doesn't the US ratify the law of the sea, the UNCLOS, that actually talks about the coastal areas that Tabitha was talking about. And Tabitha actually responded and said, the US hasn't ratified that agreement because the skepticism in Congress of some of the international organizations and their suspected potential to restrict US freedom of navigation. So for those of you that, Tabitha talked about these rules, but unfortunately the US has not ratified that treaty.
So let me clarify something. Not freedom of navigation in the sense that not in what the sense that I explained a moment ago, like actually of operations on the seas, but just our the U.S. ability to essentially do what it wants. There's this kind of part, I think, of some American thinking that I think it comes kind of out of this like the American exceptionalism type of thinking that we don't want our freedom to do what is needed to pursue American interests to be constricted by signing over some of our sovereignty to international institutions.
But doesn't that make us a bit hypercritical, or by saying, hey, China should abide by these things?
Yep. So that's, so the US says that it accepts UNCLOS as customary law and abides by it, follows it, and it's not essential to ratify it because it already, it just kind of takes it as a given essentially. But what happens is in a lot of discussions, it's not a major point, in the discussions with the Chinese, but I think subtly it does affect the discussions, because the Chinese will often say, well, you guys haven't even ratified it. How can you be saying certain things about our behavior if you guys haven't, even joined it? And so I think it would give us, a kind of a stronger position were we to do that. And for the record, most people want this. I mean, if you ask anybody who's in, the Navy or any kind of, maritime space in the U.S., for the most part, they all want it to be ratified. And it also would give us. I mean, I'm not really an international law expert at great detail, but there are some places in which it would give us just better access. So
great. Thanks very much for that clarification. Nelson, this one could take all night, and it probably starts with Susan, but there's a couple of folks have said, so, how are decisions being made in China today? There's been this crackdown on technology. There's been celebrities have been wiped off the internet. There's lots of stuff going on in China today. And is Xi Jinping waking up in the morning and deciding this is something he wants to do, or is this part of a long-term plan? That was kind of a question that came up. And also someone asked about what can we expect in Xi's third term. So perhaps that can be answered in the same vein.
Nelson, I see you unmuted. Please feel free to step in if you'd like.
I will defer to the true China scholar here.
That's very gracious, but your expertise speaks for itself. Yeah, in terms of, I think there's both signaling and implementation. Of course, in terms of thinking about some of the dramatic bans that have come out of the Xi Jinping administration, like in the tutoring industry, in the gaming industry, in other industries, I think there's some signaling that is seen as burdensome on a great cost that families bear. I wait to see the implementation over the short, medium, and long run, right? That I think it would be surprising, for example, if middle-class families did abandon their commitment to tutoring their children beyond regular school hours. If it's possible to fully ban gaming beyond a very limited period. So I think there's a signal being sent, and implementation doesn't always follow the signal. So I look forward to looking at those kind of time allocations online and implementation going forward. That said, there are a couple ways to think about it. At the central level, the party, of course, calls the shots. I saw some reference to the National People's Congress, where I think the action is not there. The action is in the top levels of the party, and especially in the leadership small groups, where really major direction is set. That said, the central government interacts with local governments, right? Provinces are the size of European states. Thousands of counties that are really on the front lines and interacting with ordinary citizens every day. And so there are different interests within the system, looking through the hierarchy, and there are also different interests at the top. When I think of the different sectors, different ministries. So I don't think we should see that, like, put a totalitarian picture on this. Because there are diverse interests, both central, local, and across sectors.
I'll just add a few comments, because I've been talking to people in China recently on the education sector. So they have banned tutoring for a lot of kids. So now there are weekend classes for parents. And of course, you have to bring your child along because of childcare purposes. So that's how a lot of people are getting around these laws now. So I've heard some of people, friends of my friends who are fluent Chinese or fluent in English have now enrolled in elementary English classes for the weekend, but their child comes along with them. So there are workarounds. There's also people now apparently selling, older people our age, that are selling their gaming rights or their, I don't know what their name, their ID number or something, so that younger people can play games beyond the period that they're supposed to. So the Chinese are very inventive about how to get around a lot of these things. Nelson, it's 6:11. Do you want to wrap up or take one more?
Why don't you give us one more?
Okay, so one gentleman asked, what can the U.S. do, or maybe what can other countries do when China redirects its economic retaliation to sectors when they target certain sectors? And I think the best example might be Australia. You know, what can a country do when China's market is so big and China retaliates for something that maybe not necessarily the same industry, but they'll retaliate by hitting back at economically by banning Australian wine as example, or Australian coal or whatever. What are countries to do about that?
I can jump in first. In the near term, there's very little you can do when China weaponizes trade, like we saw specifically when Australia was criticized by China, or when Australia thought a think tank in Australia was requesting or providing information about events in Xinjiang, and then the Australian government called for an investigation into the origins of COVID. China very quickly was able to weaponize trade in the form of banning beef imports and previously of wine imports from Australia. In the near term, there's very little you can do. But I think in the long term, really for the US to really continue to engage in a multilateral fashion with trade systems that do not allow for that kind of behavior. So the TPP would have been a great response and counterweight to that kind of behavior. So encouraging more diversification and alignment and opening of markets with countries such as Japan, with countries such as Australia, to really build a sort of trade pact that was more than just tariffs, but included, labor rights, environmental rights, data security, even required Vietnam to allow for a Leninist party system to allow for independent unions, which is kind of anathema to a Leninist party system. So that would be one course of action to help build a more resilient response, is to really encourage more diversification of those sales within a larger trade pact that does not include China, but China could aspire to potentially become part of if it reforms its practices over time. So, but in the near term, there's really not an immediate solution. What happens though is that what China found out very quickly, I think, with I think it was with respect to rare earth materials or in other products or coal, is that especially with coal, is that they can ban coal, but soon enough they're going to realize, which they did, that they simply don't have the wherewithal capacity to replace that imported product from Australia. So they very quietly sort of lowered or reduced or de-weaponized that part of the trade without a lot of headlines.
Susan, did you want to add a comment to what Spencer said?
No, I think I think he really addressed it very comprehensively, and there are other cases we might think of political actions by Norway that displeased the Chinese regime and retaliation on salmon. But as Spencer just put very nicely, those that weaponization of trade erodes over time. So yeah, I think he put it very well.
And I would just add to what Spencer said is, when they do begin to open the markets up again, like they are to Australian coal, since the message the media is controlled, it doesn't really seep down to the average person that this has happened. So they don't really understand that maybe the government has backed off on what it originally said. So just.
Well, as the moderator, let me thank Susan and Tabitha and Spencer for a wonderful after discussion from the Chinatown Hall event this week. And it was just an honor and a privilege to be on this panel with them. We hope it has added to the public understanding of the many different factors that are competing right now in forming the difficult but important bilateral relationship between the United States and China. And we thank you, Nora, again for helping to host this event for all of us.
Well, very well said, Nelson, and thanks again to all the participants and also to the University of Washington who helped co-sponsor this event. So, good night, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the event.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
My pleasure.
Nelson.
Thanks,
and all.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.